In the first two examples that I showed you, there's a confounding variable that's obvious. There's a confounding variable that really stands out. It's obviously something that the researcher should have controlled. It's the researcher's fault, basically. But confounding variables don't always stick out like a sore thumb. Sometimes they hide in the background, and they're difficult or impossible to see. And I'll actually show you an example of a study in which that would be the case, in which there might be some confounding variables hiding in the background. Let's now imagine that a researcher does a non-experimental study to look at whether people who graduate from college tend to live longer than people who don't graduate from college. And this researcher looks up a certain number of people who graduated from college, maybe online, and looks at each person's years of life, how long they lived. And the researcher looks up a certain number of people who didn't graduate from college and looks up each of their years of life. And then the researcher calculates the mean or average years of life of group 1 and the mean years of life of group 2. And let's also imagine that the researcher gets the results that we're looking at on the screen. Let's imagine that the group of college graduates did live longer on average compared to the group that didn't go to college. Well, if the researcher got the results that we're looking at, the researcher might be tempted to think that going to college makes a person likely to live longer or causes a person to have a longer life expectancy, but that might not be the case. This data set doesn't support that conclusion necessarily because there might be some other difference. There might be some other things about this first group that cause them to live longer other than the fact that they went to college. For example, this group of college graduates might be less likely to work in dangerous situations. Also, this first group might be less likely to engage in high-risk behavior because of having more conscientious personalities or more disciplined behavior. Also, this first group might be more likely to exercise or more likely to eat a healthier diet because of their education. So basically, this first group and this second group could be different from each other in many different ways, and it might be one of those unknown differences that caused one group to outlive the other. So the researcher can't confidently say that the college itself is what caused group 1 to live longer. All the researcher can say is that this first group did outlive this other group for some reason. And like I said, this is an example of a study in which there isn't a specific confounding variable that really stands out and captures your attention, but there might be some confounding variables hiding in the background. And if there might be some confounding variables hiding in the background that the researcher hasn't controlled or taken care of, then that will prevent the researcher from reaching a confident cause and effect conclusion. So if you want to reach a confident cause and effect conclusion, there are really two things that you don't want. You don't want a confounding variable that really stands out like a sore thumb, and you also don't want the possibility of confounding variables hiding in the background. So as a researcher, if you want to reach a confident cause and effect conclusion, you have to use methods to prevent confounding variables. And in the next part of this video, we'll talk about the methods that a researcher can use to prevent a study from having confounding variables, or at least reduce the number of confounding variables in the study so that the researcher can be more confident in a cause and effect conclusion. And actually, before I wrap up this video, I wanted you to think about what this researcher could have done to improve this study, to eliminate confounding variables and be more confident about about the effect of going to college on lifespan. Well, you might be thinking that the researcher should have randomly assigned the participants to two groups. The researcher should have randomly assigned one group to go to college and one group not to go to college, and then compared the lifespan of the two groups, because if the researcher did the study that way, the researcher could confidently say that the two groups are similar to each other or roughly similar, and that the college is the only obvious reason why one group would outlive the other. But a researcher couldn't do that because of ethical reasons. A researcher can't randomly assign participants to two groups and actually tell one group to go to college and tell the other group not to go to college, and then look at which group lives longer. That's about as unethical as you could get. So the researcher would have to do something other than random assignment. The researcher would have to do some type of quasi-experimental study. But it turns out that there are some things that the researcher could do as a backup plan.